Hello everyone, Ace here, and today let's talk a little bit about Jim Sterling, and how the individual running that channel no longer even knows what censorship is and is not. This became evident in the latest Jimquisition titled SEX, and is in response to the Game Jolt banning of porn-related video games. Now, most people would realize that this is in fact an example of censorship, as the commonly understood definition of censorship, as provided by Britannica, is the changing or the suppression or prohibition of speech or writing that is deemed subversive of the common good. So in other words, a game company that decides to no longer host porn-related content on its storefront, specifically because it's deemed as subversive to the common good, is undeniably engaging in censorship. But let's now hear the excuse of Jim Sterling as to why this somehow is not a case of censorship.
Now, before we carry on, I feel compelled to make a note that Game Jolt is its own business and is perfectly allowed to have its own standards for what is and isn't acceptable content. It is not censorship to remove so-called porn games from Game Jolt, it being a private enterprise. I have said as much in other situations in the past, so I know people will bring it up, and yes, it is indeed a true statement.
So ultimately, the excuse provided by Jim Sterling as to why this case of censorship is somehow not a case of censorship is that it is being done by a private company. Now, this is of course a silly requirement to arbitrarily tack on, as going back to the Britannica definition of censorship, while there is an emphasis on government itself as being a particularly common perpetrator of censorship, the Britannica makes it very clear that it, quote, occurs in all manifestations of authority to some degree, including in this case a private company's authority as to what it may or may not allow on its storefront. So clearly Jim Sterling is very much wrong to argue that this isn't a case of censorship. But let's now move on to what is the most likely motive behind making this argument in the first place. And the simplest of explanations is that Jim Sterling does not want to admit being pro-censorship, as even back as far as 2019 it was leaked that Jim does indeed support deplatforming people, and is thus now forever forced to argue that it is not somehow censorship when a private company decides to silence someone. And if Jim should at any point no longer hold that position, it would be proof that Jim Sterling is in fact pro-censorship. And for those curious, I will indeed be leaving a link in the description below to a video about that so you can check it out for yourself. But if Jim Sterling cannot use the argument that this is censorship, then you may now be wondering what reasoning was actually provided to condemn the decision by Game Jolt to ban porn-related games. And amusingly, Jim Sterling concludes that banning porn-related content is discriminatory against the LGBT ABCDEFGHIJK LMNOPQRSTUVWXYZ plus minus multiplication division community of Ulm. But don't take my word for it, here are Jim Sterling's own words about how porn bans negatively impact the members of the LGBT ABCDEFGHIJK LMNOPQRSTUVWXYZ plus minus multiplication division community of Ulm.
It's worth noting that these porn bans negatively impact LGBTQ+ content to an inordinate degree. Heck, a lot of LGBTQ+ content, sexual or not, is treated as pornographic simply by virtue of it being queer. YouTube, for example, has routinely flagged my videos as inappropriate when they're themed around LGBTQ+ issues. On Tumblr, a lot of queer creators using the site to explore their sexuality were swept up in the conflagration. The very act of being gay or trans is treated as inherently sexual, often fetishized by the cisheads. Porn bans inherently and disproportionately harm queer people. I do not, personally, believe this is entirely coincidental or accidental. Game Jolt, as I noted, is free to behave however childishly and pitifully as it sees fit, but I hope those who made the decision understand how much genuine harm that decision has caused. It may think porn is filth in need of cleaning up, but I argue that treating it as such is the more shameful act, the more harmful act. It only continues to stigmatize legitimate creators who have just as much right to exist and are as equally valuable as anybody else.
So basically, Jim Sterling's position is that banning porn is problematic because, according to Jim Sterling, the members of the LGBT ABCDEFG HIJK LMNO PQRSTUV WXYZ plus minus multiplication division community of Ohm are apparently disproportionately sexual degenerates. And note, this is not me making this argument, this is Jim Sterling's argument. Because I think most people will actually agree that morality is a social construct in its own right. Because, let's face it, what is deemed moral in the UK is not exactly the same as what is deemed moral in, say, Pakistan. So the fact that Jim Sterling is arguing that porn is fundamentally considered immoral in the United States, while at the same time arguing that porn bans in the United States are discriminatory towards the LGBT ABCDEFG HIJK LMNO PQRSTUV WXYZ plus minus multiplication division community of Ohm, is Jim Sterling indeed arguing that members of that particular community are sexual degenerates, according to Jim Sterling's understandings of the moral standards of the United States, which I am sure is not the intended message, but nevertheless something that I find to be rather amusing. But to move on to my thoughts, I ultimately believe that what Game Jolt did is indeed an example of censorship. And the fact that they've done this after already allowing games on in the first place that fit this category is something that does deserve to be condemned. Unlike Jim Sterling, though, I not only admit that this is a case of censorship, but also, unlike Jim Sterling, I do not personally believe that people who are gay, trans, queer, etc., I do not believe that such people are fundamentally sexually degenerate. Although I can't say the same about the woke activists. Not after dealing with so many of them that have advocated for some of the worst things humanly possible. And especially not when that particular advocacy is clearly the result of the far leftist ideologies that they follow. But in any case, this has been Ace. Hope to see you guys again soon. Take care. Ace out.